Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. I would like to welcome you to the third presentation in FortneyScott's OFCCP Retools Contractor Compliance Webinar Series. I would like to address some preliminary items before we start today's briefing. Currently, all listeners' phones are muted. At any time during the presentation, please feel free to submit a question in the GoToWebinar question box. We will try to answer all questions. Today's topic is Impact of OFCCP Audit Directive. Our presenters are FortneyScott Attorneys, David Fortney and Elizabeth Bradley. I will now turn the program over to David and Liz.
Great. Valerie, thank you so much, and it's wonderful to be with everyone. Hi, Liz. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you for inviting me to join you today.
Well, listen, wouldn't be an OFCCP party without you, so here we go. So this is our third of the three-part webinar series, as Valerie indicated, because there have been these three significant OFCCP developments. So let me just say a brief word about who we are for those that may not know. Just briefly, of course, we are a Washington, D.C.-based law firm. Our practice encompasses the federal agencies, and of particular note, we do a lot of OFCCP work. Many, if not most of our clients, in fact, are federal contractors, and among other things, are very focused on compliance with their OFCCP obligations. So anything related to that space, as well as other areas involving the EEOC, the National Labor Relations Board, and a host of the federal agency-related matters involves our practice. Also, I just would like to give a shout out to the podcast that we do every 2 weeks or so, the DC Insider Employer Update. Great way to keep on top of developments there, and we typically unpack whatever's hot and happening with the agencies or on the Hill in Washington that's of interest to employers. So let's dive into this third part, and that is really this new audit directive. So this is sort of the third in the trifecta, Liz, right? We had the portal, the new portal and verification, and we've covered that. We had the new pay equity directive that suggests that contractors are supposed to be doing pay equity compliance assessments annually. And now we have the third development, which is this new directive that revamps the audit procedures. And I would say generally it's not great news for employers, contractors, but we'll go through that and sort that out a little bit. So Liz, why don't we jump right into it?
Sure. So the subject, it's Directive 2022-02. The subject of it is stated to be the effective compliance evaluations and enforcement. And the purpose is to provide transparency on OFCCP's compliance evaluation policies and expectations for contractors. This is a refresh under this administration. What are contractors going to expect from the OFCCP during compliance evaluations? And I think what's really going to be important is before we dive too deeply into what does this new Directive 2022-02 say, I think it's first for us, let's look back and look at the directives that this directive rescinds. So I'm going to pass it over to David here next. Can you walk through the directives from the prior administration that this directive replaces? I think that gives us a foundation to build from.
And Liz, I find it kind of reminds me of the adage, in my experience, when the government says we're here to help you or we're here to do all these wonderful things, watch out, because it typically means that's really not what's going to occur. So note that one of the objectives that you just stated, it's lifted right out of the new directive, is to provide transparency. Now, as part of providing transparency, they are rescinding the directive addressing transparency. So just saying. But seriously, the directive, the new directive by the Biden administration actually rescinds not one, but four different directives. These were often referred to as the four pillars by the prior administration, and often or sometimes in the contractor community referred to as CERT, C-E-R-T, the four pillars of the 4 CERT directives that were implemented by the Trump administration. And those directives included ones focused on certainty in OFCCP's policies and practices, that is clarity, standardized practices so people would know the rules of the road and audits would work more efficiently. Efficiency, these are all interrelated, but that the agency would work to be efficient, to not get bogged down in audits that lasted forever with uncertain criteria. Recognition of contractors, that is having a process whereby contractors' exemplary efforts were recognized and contractors were incentivized to do that. And finally, transparency. What the agency does, because it is, by the way, following Title VII principles, that the agency would be transparent about what the factors are, what the analytics they're doing, because as anyone knows who's been involved in an OFCCP audit, if you don't have that, you can really get kind of bogged down in what, you know, how the audit's going to proceed and what happens next. But I do find a little bit rich, Liz, that to promote transparency and efficiency in audits, they are rescinding these 4 pillars dealing with certainty, efficiency, recognition, and transparency, which many of us thought were pretty darn good and pretty helpful.
I agree, and I think it's going to be interesting to see how, and as we get into the meat of this new directive, but what the directive says versus what we're going to see play out, and whether it's actually going to result in increased efficiencies or not. And I think that's something we can talk through with each one of the new modifications.
You know, Liz, one thing before we really do that, let's remember what inspired these new audit procedures. OFCCP had been conducting audits from the Obama administration and through the first part of the Trump administration in a manner that resulted in them pursuing some very high-profile enforcement proceedings, very protracted, very expensive for the agency, not to mention for the contractors, and resulted in, candidly, some pretty spectacular total losses by the agency. That all these audit procedures, these sort of vague audit procedures, had not yielded favorable outcomes for the agency, either in the analogic litigation followed by the Oracle litigation, both of which were a total rejection by the Labor Department's own administrative law judge. Remember that what the prior administration said was, look, we need to stop doing audits in that manner so that we and that's the 4 pillars. That's what those 4 pillars came from. So it's interesting to me because some of those were really just put in place in the last, year and a half, 2 years, which isn't very long to bear fruit, why they are being rescinded and whether that will be effective. I kind of openly wonder, honestly, whether they will be.
No, I mean, I think one of the stated reasons in the directive is saying that some of these procedures that were put in place, the transparency and certainty procedures caused a delay in processing audits through. I don't know if that's actually accurate. A lot of the requirements are once there is a violation and what needs to go through. I'm not seeing that there was a significant uptick in the timing of processing initial audits. So the efficiency directive that they're rescinding did ask for a goal to have the audits completed in 180 days. I don't think I saw any action where that actually happened, any compliance evaluations that truly closed that quickly. So I think there are other log jams in their process. I don't think it's necessarily these transparency directives that they're rescinding now, but we will see as this rolls out.
We will see. You're right.
So let's dive into what the new OFCCP audit procedures are. And I think the first one we want to talk about is the compliance evaluation scheduling. So they have said that they're going to be enhancing the neutral scheduling procedures. What this is going to, rewind back to 2 of our webinars before, is the portal. They are going to be looking at that, who is certifying, and using that information to create a new CSAL list and for scheduling purposes. They are going to continue to be transparent with what their scheduling, their neutral scheduling protocols and procedures are. So I don't think there's going to be a lot of change in that process where they're going to be issuing a CSAL. They'll be giving the the protocols that they applied to developing that list, and they'll be transparent there. Where we are going to see the big change with the scheduling is, I think these are two pretty significant changes. The first is they are no longer going to delay issuing scheduling letters for 45 days following the issue of the CSAL. There used to be that 45-day grace period that you could check the list and you know your letter may be coming. So that's going away. And the other significant change, is they are rescinding the sort of automatic 30-day extension if you were to submit your AAP, some of the non-data driven components of your affirmative action plan. If you submitted that within 30 days, or in the timely on 30 days, you could get an automatic 30-day extension to do the remaining responses to your itemized listing, etc. That is gone. And the big concept here is they are taking the position, and I'll say this is one component of these regs that I'm not sure I necessarily, that we can necessarily find a legal challenge to or a problem with. So their concept is, as a federal contractor, you're required to have a plan in place within 120 days of being a federal contractor. And then every year you need to be timely preparing your updated AAP at the start of your AAP year. In addition to the regulatory obligation to be preparing your AAPs on an annual basis, you are now going to be certifying. You're going to be going out to that portal and certifying that you are in compliance. So the concept here is, if you've certified that you're in compliance and you're following your regulatory obligations, your affirmative action plan should be prepared. It should be on the shelf. And understanding that 30-day period will be necessary to develop some of the materials that are unique to an audit. The itemized listing materials, your detailed compensation, your reasonable accommodation logs, some of those nuanced pieces. And they are very restricted in the when an extension of time will be granted. So they have essentially, they've said it's extraordinary circumstances, the death in the family or death of an individual who is responsible in the business, some sort of act of God that is impacting business. I'm wondering if they had COVID in mind a little bit when they put that requirement in. What's noticeably not on the list of extraordinary circumstances, and what's noticeably omitted here, is what about contractors who get their scheduling letter in the first month of their AAP year? That's going to be a lift. You're still pulling data, preparing your plans. So, I think that is a place that we're going to kind of be a wait and see. If a contractor gets a scheduling letter within that time period, is that going to be sufficient to request an extension of time? But realistically, David, if you can't get your plan in, the whole submission in 30 days, what is the agency going to do? Let's play this out on how do these new deadlines really impact you, contractors, in the life of an audit?
Right. So let's talk about that. So first of all, as a practical matter, presumably within the 30 days, you're going to turn something in, even if you can't get it all done, like the pulling the data, but you'll say, and you'll give whatever the reasons are, business exigencies, whatever it may be. What the Labor Department has now indicated through this directive is that they will consider that a potential denial of access. They will also treat it as a potential admission, right, that you don't have the record and weren't able to produce it in a timely fashion. What a denial of access means that it can be referred for enforcement on that basis right there alone and come forward. Now, as a practical matter, what happens if the agency does that? Usually you're given an opportunity to respond, then it goes to the solicitor's office. The solicitors typically will look at it. There's normally some communication with the contractor. I think as a practical matter, those communications, even if they're expedited, 2 weeks, 30 days would be the normal period of time. Again, if you've produced the initial response and now you've done the supplemental while this is going on, you effectively, I think you would argue, we have mooted the entire problem. It's now resolved. We have turned it in. So at most, I mean, they're going to say, well, under our procedures, you should have done it in 30 days. You took 42 days. Okay, that's not a regulatory violation, but it does. I mean, so I think you don't ask for an extension. You sort of negotiate. You deal with this, but it does potentially kind of leave a little bit of a sour taste, don't you think, with the auditor, Liz?
Right.
I mean, that's the bigger practical concern.
Right. So to that point, to David's point is, okay, you don't get it in time, probably not going to end up in enforcement over that piece because you will have cured before they're going to take the effort of going into enforcement. But what you have done is you started off on the wrong foot with the compliance officer. And I think all of us who live in this world and do this work knows that relationship with that compliance officer, that really drives the depth of a lot of these data requests. How onerous it really is kind of driven by the compliance officer or the local audit office. So you don't want to get on the wrong foot, because as we're going to talk about here in a few minutes, the level of data and documents that this directive is authorizing compliance officers to go and grab is broad, both in temporal scope, how wide they can go and how deep they can go. They're very broad. So you just kind of want to make sure that if you can at least get your initial submissions in on time, start that good faith relationship with the compliance officer. I think that's going to really serve you well.
You know, one other thing, Liz, that strikes me, this neutral scheduling list. I'm sorry, let's stay back on that slide for a minute. The neutral scheduling procedures. As a practical matter, what they're saying here is, you touched on this, they're going to use the certification, and certainly they've got a list of contractors they expect to certify. Those that don't certify are very likely now to be audited. And furthermore, what has been the practice for many, many years now, which is a very small set of contractors keep being audited again and again and again. The information we have, and as we understand what's going to happen here, is that these audits are now going to start spreading out to a number of contractors, many of whom may not have seen OFCCP for quite a long time. Mm-hmm. So those that have not been part of, I'll call it the OFCCP frequent flyer group, need to be particularly mindful. If you're a federal contractor that has not been audited for a while, the revised neutral scheduling procedures have significantly increased the likelihood, particularly if you don't fully respond to the portal, which we covered in our first webinar. That is, we understand, going to be the short list of who'd be audited, and then you'd face all these other demands that we just touched on.
Yep, and to that, and then we can move off the slide, but to that point, and I think we touch on this later on as well, but as soon as the CSAL list comes out, you need to be checking it. Are you on it? Because while the 45-day period is the grace period's no longer in place, they're not sending all, what we don't believe, they're not going to send all of the scheduling letters on day one, likely, because they can't process them. So unless you are going to be in that very first round of scheduling letters, you are going to have periods of time to get up to speed. So knowing that they're not going to take favorable on a 30-day request, you need to know, are you on the list, and you need to be working towards, so that you are not in a position to have to ask for an extension or play that game once you get the scheduling letter.
Right. So those that are on this new CSAL list, which we expect before Memorial Day, we understand it's imminent, and that you need to check that, because if you're on the list, you should, as Liz indicates, be ready to respond within 30 days when you get your audit notice. All right. Well, let's go on to the next slide now and talk a little bit about what happens next. You do the basic audit submission. That's prescribed by regulations, but then we move into the next phase, as those that have been audited know, the request for information, RFI, which basically is a request for documents and data that needs to be produced. And there are some pretty significant changes there, what we're calling the good news, bad news concept. There is some good news, and if the agency does what it says it's going to do, and again, this directive is new, but it's effective now, the agency is committed. The good news is that it will reasonably tailor the request, the subsequent request, that is building on the desk audit, to specific areas of concern. So it's not going to be give us everything on hiring. In other words, if they have a pay concern, it should be compensation related data. And presumably, when it says tailored to areas of concern, I would assume it's the compensation data for the relevant segment of the workers involved, but we'll see. It will allow contractors a reasonable time to respond. We don't know what reasonable is. It's probably less than 30 days since you had 30 days to respond, but we will see. But that is a point because in the past, Liz and I both experienced RFIs where they wanted a response in 5 days or less than 1 business week. That's not reasonable, period. But they've committed to that. And the final point, the good news is, they're going to include the basis for the request. Now, before we get too excited, I mean, let's just talk about the good news piece,
Right.
because I'm a little concerned about the basis. It's going to be, I think we got some indicators.
Well, I
Is that
mean, like
enough?
David, I guess my question to you is, what is an area of concern? That seems to be a term that they're using. How are they going to define an area of concern?
Well, and particularly, Liz, when you contrast this with those 4 pillars, the directives that were rescinded, where the agency was tasked with very specifically modeling your employment, your hiring, your compensation based on the factors identified by the contractor, being transparent and disclosing what the agency's analysis showed, and if there were indicators, what the indicators were, what the jobs were, and so forth that we're going to be focused on. Now, that level of commitment by the agency is completely erased. All the agency is going to say, and all they have to say, all they've committed to is, we've got some concerns, and it involves hiring. Okay, well, what is it? Is it our screening process? Is it the tests we use? What is it? No, we just have concerns. We think there's some, there's some flags. What are the flags? Well, we're not prepared to discuss that. We just need more information from you. I think that the agency is committed to doing nothing more than those very broad brush statements.
Yep.
I hope I'm wrong, but it would appear that way, because what they have rejected actually required them with specificity to tell us what the areas of concern were.
Yeah. I'm concerned about what is a reasonable time to respond. This sounds promising, and yet this month, so after this directive has come out, I have a couple audits where we were actually given 2 business days to respond.
Right.
Fortunately, it was a fairly easy question, and we were able to meet that without having to push back. We would have if we needed to, but I have concerns that we're going to end up getting those very detailed RFIs with very short time frames, and I'm not sure who's going to be the arbiter of reasonableness.
Right. Well, that's the good news part of the directive on the RFIs and data. And what about the bad news? And this is potentially the scoping. What the temporal scope is. What's the time period? And the new directive makes clear that basically, kind of as a default, they're going to look back 2 years. That did not used to be the case. It used to be that it was a standard 1 year, and then they could extend or expand to 2 years. So now it appears they're defaulting to 2 years,
and let
which
me just
is new.
say, say on that one, also request just received. There was an indicator for a job group, for terminations for a job group, and they automatically asked for the terminations for 2 years for that job group. I look at the underlying data, there was 1 termination during the AP year. And so what is the basis for that? So they are going deep based on very minor indicator. I mean, it was a selection of less than 1 whole person, since the whole selection was a 1 in the data. So this is something that we're going to be seeing as an automatic. If there's an indicator, they're just, it's without thought, they're asking for 2 years of data.
Right. And that illustrates, Liz, what you just described, that overly mechanical approach. I mean, that's not even a bona fide indicator, honestly. Correct. We should not be wasting time doing that, either the agency or our client's time, the contractor's time. So that gives some areas they would have an area of concern, no longer a meaningful statistical indicator or bona fide, legally cognizable basis, just, have an area of concern. Very low bar, no bar almost to do that. Of course, the level of requests, we've covered the temporal scope, and I might add a practical point. When they ask for 2 years worth of data, they are likely to combine it and analyze it in one rolled up data set, as opposed to the individual 1 year of data that we historically have looked at, AAP year, plan year by plan year, which is typically how these issues have always been resolved. So I think that's going to come to play too. What about the scoping of the request? Very broad, right?
Yeah.
All the personnel activity, all details on policy implementation, all details on compensation data. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. Exhaustive. Could be extremely burdensome to respond to those. I'm worried about that.
Yeah, I mean, and this is sort of an automatic look at continuing with the compensation discussion, but all forms of compensation, all increases. I'm starting to look at requests for retention bonuses, all types of things, and that goes back for a full 2 years. And limiting how that, also seeing a request where your population is as it is in your AAP year, and then often you only give the 2 years of data for the population as it was in your plan year. They're saying, no, we want it for everybody who was in the plan for the prior year. So it's expanding your roster as well and seeking that additional information. So there's a lot to be unpacked here. And when they are asking for the 2 years of data, there's a lot of strategy that needs to go into what you think is actually relevant and where can you push back, because I do think this is going to be where the agency is going to expand the audit beyond even the workforce that was in play in the initial scope of the audit.
That's a great point. Well, and finally, they deal very explicitly with the record retention. And of course, there is a provision in the regulation that says if you destroy records that are relevant to the audit, once you're notified of the audit and you haven't maintained them, then an inference can be drawn. But of course, this now picks up the language of or fail to preserve. And as we know from experience, there's lots of times where electronic records either get overwritten or you change HRIS systems and there's inadvertent dropping of the records that are incomplete. There's a whole variety of things, none of which it wasn't destruction, as that term is typically understood. And candidly, it should not result in an adverse inference. But they seem to be really kind of taking the gloves off on this, don't you think, Liz?
This is, let's go back to that definition of area of concern. This is one for me. So here's the thing I often find in audits is the agency will ask for copies of records for X requirement, but there actually is no regulatory obligation to keep such documents or to create and therefore keep records. So the agency takes the position, if you didn't interview notes, great example. If you don't take interview notes, you don't create those, and therefore you don't maintain them, they say, well, we want the interview notes. So here's an assumption of regulatory obligation now that if you're not making the notes such that you're not required to keep them, and now they're saying because you don't have them, there's a presumption that they're unfavorable. This, I think, is going to be very problematic because the agency likes to think that all contractors have a warehouse full of paper copies of things and interview notes, manager notes, all of these other types of notes with regard to the hiring process. I really see that this is going to be a place. They're now going to say it's a requirement. You're not going to have them. I see going forward to a conciliation agreement where now you're going to be required to start creating records that you have actually no regulatory obligation to create. So this is my
I agree with you. And I'll give you an example. We had a client that team, they had yellow Post-its that they would, kind of jot notes on, little jotted notes. Then at the end, they would populate their designated form. They'd collect all the tracking information and what the reasons were. And of course, they discarded the Post-its because they had those jotted notes while they may have been on the phone or interviewing the candidate. They'd taken that information and now entered it into the required form. Once the agency learned of the jotted notes, the Post-its, and of course they didn't have them, nor were they supposed to keep them, they took the position that there was a failure to preserve. And these were work notes, they weren't records, they were designed to help us create the records. We had a big knockdown over this exact issue that they now have codified in this new directive. So I think it's a problem.
But it's going away from the entire concept of people don't, the agency still asks a lot of contractors, do people still fill out a paper application? Well, no. I mean, so, we've moved,
Right.
most companies have moved away from that.
Right.
So the whole concept of an electronic applicant tracking system where maintained electronically, and then your reason for not selecting is captured in your disposition codes, the stage and the why.
Right.
That is your electronic notes, and that is the official record. And the agency is essentially kind of unwinding all of the technological advancements that and efficiencies that are captured in electronic applicant tracking system by now saying you have to maintain your posting notes. And it's really just an unrealistic expectation and a lack of understanding of how high volume hiring really happens.
I agree with you. But as they say, there's even more, isn't there? So what about witnesses? Let's talk about, because they've also given some new direction on witnesses and other related information.
Right. So this is, I think, another place where they've sort of, that's not codified because this isn't law or rule, but they've put down on pen and paper in a formal way their expectation, because this is a fight I think they often have in audits, is they want employee contact information, personal contact information for both employees and applicants. How many times have we submitted the applicant tracking log or our employee roster with a unique ID and not included contact information? Everybody does it that way as the initial way. We're not inviting the agency in to contact those individuals directly. That is no longer going to be acceptable. The agency is expecting us to include applicant and employees' personal contact information when we submit those logs. This is going to be a game changer. So if we can kind of go back for a moment, this is going to be a game changer. One, I think there's going to be a number of our employees who do not want their personal contact information shared broadly with a government agency. We're going back to that point of retaliation. The agency is pushing back and kind of saying they're not going to be favorable to contractors asking for permission to release the information. They're saying that that's going to have a chilling effect on their ability to get that information. Another huge piece of this that I have to believe it was, I don't know, but that they want social security number for these individuals. And wow, is that problematic? So I can envision a scenario when, if you're at the end of a conciliation agreement and you are facilitating payment, you need to locate a defined class of individuals. Okay, social security number may need to be shared. But I have no other idea what the basis for including social security number in a communication to the agency that includes all applicants. We probably don't even have social security number for applicants, but social security number for your employees. The potential risk of that data being breached and the PII concerns with regard to sharing social security numbers with the agency is real. This agency has had data breaches before. Laptops have been left on trains. The stories are they're out there. That piece really concerns me. David, your thoughts on this personal contact information?
This personal identification information, PII, these social security numbers, I think is extremely troubling. A couple of weeks ago, I was at the American Bar Association meeting, and the chief career lawyer, Bev Dankowitz, who was very involved in writing this, she was asked about this, like, why are you doing this? Her answer was interesting. She goes, I was concerned too. And this is OFCCP's lawyer. This is her public response. I was surprised and concerned too, because typically we only use that, as Liz indicated, if we can't find certain class members to effect a payment of a settlement. But otherwise, because this isn't limited, this applies to all current and former employees. You would now have to provide their personal email, their personal cell phone, and their social security number. Which, by the way, just a little vignette, this is within the last month or two, the agency asked, not one of our clients, a contractor who the employees all have government security clearances. And the OFC insisted that they were entitled to this type of information. The contractor said no, and we mean really no, unless you can provide some reason. I mean, and the government couldn't. They said, no, that's just what we want. And they've really come to loggerheads on that. We had another client where we thought we had negotiated. We said, look, we will survey all of our current employees and ask them if they mind disclosing. This is a heavily regulated operation. Of the thousands of employees, you can count on one hand the employees that said, I'm good with having you give the government my PII. The Labor Department then, when they were told that, none of the employees will consent to giving you their cell phone or their social security number or their personal email. The Labor Department's response was, we don't care. We are insisting that you provide it or we will claim denial of access.
Yep.
Update, we have not yet acquiesced to that. We have decided to stand by our employees, and we'll see. But I think this is a dramatic overreach.
Absolutely. And that goes to the next point here. And what they want to do with that information is they're going to be reaching out and conducting interviews. And they're taking the position that you have no right to be present during interviews of former employees unless they are being interviewed based on the position as a manager or agent of the company. We know that they have done this before. They reach out. Here's a question, current employees. They're reaching out to current employees also. And here's a fun question for those of you who want to cross out of OFCCP land and into wage and hour world with me for a moment. You have a government agency reaching out to current employees on their cell phones outside of business hours to conduct an interview with them about their employment. Is that billable time? Is that compensable time under, wage and hour laws? You bet it is. I mean, they're doing work. I mean, they're not. That's not their personal time. They're not choosing to have that behavior. It's the agency reaching out to them. And I think this question has been posed to OFCCP, and they were a little bit of deer in the headlights with it, and not realizing the disconnect between why why employers need to know if they are reaching out to their employees so that they can properly compensate them for the time. So I have a feeling that this is going to spin in a few different ways, and contractors need to be very aware of and stay up on top of these issues.
OFC, you're exactly right, Liz, was completely gobsmacked when they got the question of whether this was compensable time, having employees interviewed. Of course, it's compensable time. They're like, well, we'll talk to the wage hour division and get a ruling on that. And of course, this isn't just the federal Fair Labor Standards Act. This involves all 50 states' wage and hour laws. That was another news flash to the agency. They committed that they were going to issue some follow-up FAQs. So the day that they issued the directive, they immediately were saying, we have to clean it up with FAQs to clarify and address this. Now that's been 3 weeks. I haven't seen any. I'm not aware of any, and I don't know what they're doing about that. But I will tell you, certainly our advice to our clients is, if people are being interviewed by the government relating to what they do at their job, about the job, that's compensable,
yep.
Period. And whatever your timekeeping system is, whatever's required to pay them, those protocols should be followed. I would be transparent with OFCCP about that. That we are instructing people, if you contact them and they're interviewed, they're going to put that on their timesheet. Of course, the government's out of its mind because they're like, well, now you'll know who we interviewed. It's like, well, what are we supposed to do? Now, there's less of an issue, I might say, if you have exempt salaried employees. Then unless you're on a government contractor, you have to charge your time, any work-related time, you have to charge it as non-billable or not, it's not chargeable to the contract, but still carried as overhead. You have to record all your time. This still would be recordable time. Whether it's compensable needs to be sorted out. So I think this is, again, these directives were clearly rushed out. There was no interface with the contractor community, because had there been socializing some of these concepts, whether we agreed with them or not, we certainly could have alerted them to these types of issues.
Correct.
It's unfortunate. Well, let's slog on. Yes. So this is also new. Historically, and certainly Liz and I have a number of examples where we have clients that have more than one establishment, shall we say, sometimes many more than one establishment on the CSAL list. And we often have clients that may have more than one establishment, many establishments being simultaneously audited. Now, historically, those audits have pretty well run kind of, I'll call it in a siloed fashion. You have establishment A, you get the RFI, you get the data, you get the witnesses, you do establishment A. You have establishment B, etc. They may occur at the same time, they may not, there may be coordination on timing, but each of the audits is freestanding based on the establishment, or if it's a functional AAP, the FAP involved. In the new directive, the agency has said that it's now going to, the euphemism is coordinate the evaluations. And of course, this is sold as contractors, this is good for you. We're going to coordinate, so it'll all be great. And so if you have a common pay policy or practice, you only have to explain it once. Okay, that's useful. But of course, what they also mean is, as we understand, and that has been explained to us, they're going to coordinate the audit results, meaning combine them and look at them. This is the beginning of what I call regulatory creep. The regulations only specify that they can audit an AAP, a FAP or an AAP. We know that the agency wants to change those regulations so that AAPs will become much broader, more like functional AAPs, not establishment. But in the meantime, that takes 2 years conservatively to change those regs. In the meantime, they're changing the audit protocols to begin to effectuate that consolidation or combination, coordination, to use the euphemistic term, coordination and combination of data. This is very potentially adverse to clients. Yes, the coordination, the efficiency, explain our pay system once, that's great. Give the policies to you once, terrific. But once you start coordinating all the data and results, not necessarily so good. And I'm not sure they're entitled to do that under their current regulations.
Right. I mean, I question the legality of this, but in the practical, how broadly are they going to do this consolidation? So my mind is thinking, if it's within a same region, okay, if you are looking at our hiring practices and our recruitment practices, maybe they're going to be consistent across that region. But compensation, I don't know. Does market go into impacting compensation? So if you're going to be combining audits that are in two vastly different regions of the country with vastly different costs of living, and then you're going to conduct an analysis, and we know how the OFCCP does their initial comp analysis, which is an uncontrolled analysis by either EEO1 or job group. You're going to have people who are paid vastly different compensation levels simply based on the location, based on cost of living and market data. And then that gets to the immediate, they have concerns based on false comparators, and immediately that's just going to roll into a very broad overreach by the agency and a misunderstanding of the data in a way. So
that's
I think
correct.
I
mean, I can see once you get these multiple audits, you get the initial desk audit submissions, the area of concern, that bar is that threshold so low, and when they combine them, the RFIs that follow are going to be quite overwhelming, and they're going to be at multiple locations. So I think this part, this kind of adds but helps put into focus all those other factors we just walked through, because it amplifies and multiplies the problem. It isn't just one establishment. Now it could be 4 or 5 locations, multiple states, etc.
Right.
And I think this is going to be extremely challenging.
But I think part of this is let's plan ahead, right? So let's look at the CSAL list.
Yep.
Do you have multiple locations on that CSAL list? Okay, let's prepare for it with this in mind. I'm going to go back to compensation as the example we're kind of living with here. We already kind of say some of the best practices you've probably heard FortneyScott Attorneys advise is when you submit your item 19 narrative, you tell them how to analyze the comp. You say,
Right.
here's the appropriate groupings. Here's the appropriate factors. You know what you also need to start now having that narrative about is, does market data impact compensation? Do you need to be layering into your item 19 report a column that actually has the, something about a geographic area or something in that, so that then your narrative can say employees in different regions are paid based on, comparable merit data, blah, 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 something along those lines, so that you are immediately, when they do combine your data and do a flawed analysis, you can take them right back to the materials you submitted with the initial submission that told them that wouldn't be a proper analysis.
Right.
So I think
right. So we need to be strategic when we're pulling that together.
Absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely.
So does OFC have the resources to do this?
No,
I mean, let's
wish
talk about,
did.
they apparently think they don't. Yeah.
So
Let's touch
I
on
don't
this
want
quickly.
to, yeah, I don't want to spend too much time here because this is the dream scenario. They are seeking 41 million, so they want to increase their budget from 105 million to 147, and that is essentially, a 50% increase in what their staffing levels. This is so that they can go as broad as they want in the data and as deep down into your audits, and these are sort of their goals. Realistically, Fortney, I think you can give us a few sound bites on this.
Yeah.
I mean, are they ever going to get $41 million increase in their budget this year? Probably
No.
not.
I mean, the short answer is no. Look, this past year, the current fiscal year, the budget that was just passed, and this is with as friendly a setting as they're going to experience during the Biden administration. Democrats, not with big majorities, control both the House and the Senate and the White House. OFC got 2.5% increase, 2.5%, okay? If you look at the election predictions that I've been reading, it would suggest that at least the House is likely to change. The House is where budgets originate, and it is highly unlikely that this agency will receive anywhere close to the type of budget that they have proposed. They'll be lucky to see 2.5% again, but we'll see. But so I think the thing that's more interesting in the budget isn't so much dollars, but to take a little time, and we won't spend on it, but looking at those goals, that reflects the agency's priorities. And I think they're borne out by many of the changes that we've just discussed.
I mean, and I think the first two bullets, building effective contractor compliance evaluations, they're looking to redress systematic employment discrimination. Bullet 2, empowering employers to identify potential systematic issues in contractor workforce. Their practices, they want to go broader. They want to be looking for systematic. That is where this agency is going. They're no longer really looking at that low-hanging fruit of the one job group in one location that has a hiring shortfall. They want to see what is the overall more of a systematic outreach and a problem, and want to solve that on a broader. So that's where this agency is trying to go, and what they're trying to facilitate in their compliance evaluations.
Note that stronger partnerships with different organizations, that also, I think, rolls up and identifies the coordination agreements that the agency has been entering into with private class action lawyers, whereby lawyers who are bringing parallel civil litigation claims against federal contractors are entering into information sharing and coordination agreements with OFCCP and having discussions while the agency is conducting an audit, serving these very broad RFIs, data collections that we've just gone over, and potentially sharing that with plaintiffs' lawyers who are also coordinating and bringing litigation. This is tough. And so even if they don't get all the resources they want, and they're not going to, these objectives they're still going to try to pursue, albeit with more limited resources.
I think I'd rather them have more compliance officers than partnerships with plaintiffs' attorneys.
Yeah.
But
right. Yeah,
right.
I'm with you on that. I'm with you on that. All right. So let's wrap up with a few things on kind of what this means for folks. So
okay.
What's on the horizon, Liz? Yeah.
Be prepared to respond within 30 days to a scheduling letter. Be active looking for that CSAL list. When it gets published, check your locations. Are you on it? Start preparing for the audit now. You can start gathering those itemized listing documents. You can start being prepared for that, because even if it gets rolled into the next AAP year, you just heard us say you may need 2 years of data anyway. So none of this proactive preparation will be for naught. So be sure you look at this closely and be prepared.
Yeah. Now the PII, like the social security numbers, the personal cell phone, personal email, we discussed that pretty extensively. Those are going to be the standard requests. And you are going to need to decide, are we just going to acquiesce and provide it for everyone requested? Are we going to notify our employees? Are we going to give employees some ability to try to opt out? Are we willing to take a denial of access over that issue to protect our employees' legitimate privacy interests? And I might add, folks, check not only the federal privacy statutes, check your relevant state law considerations. Once again, in discussions we've had with the OFCCP, they had not a clue that there could be some extra requirements imposed on federal contractors that could put at odds the government without any cause, without any justification. This broad brush, just give it for everyone. I think the government is on much stronger ground if they need it because they can't pay someone in a settlement class. We're not suggesting that's objectionable. It's the one size fits everyone that you have to provide this. So I think this takes some time. There's a lot of considerations, and contractors, if you're on the CSAL list, I would strongly encourage you begin to work through these issues in advance, not in that 30-day window that you're going to have to deal with.
Agree. Back to there'll be multiple coordinated audits. Again, this ties to checking the CSAL list. If you realize you have multiple locations, come up with a consolidated strategy for how you're going to respond. You don't have to, obviously you're not going to submit consolidated, but look at your data in a way that you know the agency may be looking at it combined. So for example, do you submit by job title or job group? What's going to be best across both audits? I wouldn't submit one by job title and one by job group. The agency will ask you why you did it differently. So start thinking about these as if they would be combined.
Final thing is retaliation, and this administration is extremely focused on retaliation, and retaliation will be inferred even if there is perceived reluctance, if your employees are unwilling to speak to the government. The agency has indicated that it is likely to suggest or accuse the contractor, you must be doing something to chill their interest or willingness to participate. So this, I think, is something that if you know audits are coming, a generalized communication to your workforce, we're subject to a routine audit, it's coming, the government may want to speak to people, our policy is that people are encouraged. If you want to participate, please participate, and please be truthful when you participate, or a statement to that effect. And have that in advance. It goes to everyone. That way, when you are accused of chilling or retaliating, you can say, look, even before you showed up, this is what we told people. It helps. It would help. So I think those are good practical takeaways. But I think the biggest point, Liz, on all this is contractors need to be, to use an overused term, proactive. You need to start getting ready. If you're on the CSAL list, you're going to get audited, and it's going to be under these new, very demanding terms. And you can't wait to start preparing when you get your audit notice.
Yep. And even after the 30-day submission, which is a demanding, the RFIs are going to come in. They're going to be extensive. And even though they claim that they're going to give you a reasonable time to respond, we don't anticipate it's going to be very, very long. We think that they're going to come in at a fairly rapid pace and expect your attention.
I agree. Well, Liz, I appreciate this discussion. I think it's really been great. Obviously, folks, we're going to continue to really closely monitor these developments, and there will be updates. In fact, this week there's an oversight hearing, so maybe there will be some nuggets from with Director Yang, Jenny Yang from OFCCP, and Chair Charlotte Burrows from the EEOC are both appearing before a House subcommittee, so maybe there'll be further information on the new directive or any of the items we've covered in this three-part webinar series. If you need information, reach out to us. We are really on top of these developments regularly, or shoot us an email. I just thank everyone for joining us. Liz, thank you as always. Great discussion today, and we want to thank everyone.